The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, I'm Evelyn Kent with Smartlogic. Richard Pender couldn't join us today as he is home tending to one of his sons who has been laid low by an everyday childhood illness. But welcome and thanks for joining us for this short presentation. Our very knowledgeable and entertaining Charlie Holland is going to take you through our Semaphore for SharePoint solution in about 30 minutes. At the end, we'll answer a few questions, so please send yours through to the GoToWebinar chat box. Charlie is responsible for our SharePoint integration project here at Smartlogic. He has about 10 years of experience working with SharePoint, and he is the author of Microsoft SharePoint 2010 Web Applications, the complete reference. He's based in Scotland, as you'll hear, and he's been developing software for about the past 20 years. During that time, he's worked with a number of companies covering a range of industries from petrochemicals and financial services to healthcare and electronics. You can see Charlie's contact details on the slide. Feel free to contact him with questions about the webinar or our SharePoint for Semaphore for SharePoint integration. And with that, I'll hand off to Charlie.
Thanks for that. Thank you all for joining. Let's get started with this thing. I think we've all got a common problem, SharePoint. Now don't get me wrong, SharePoint's a great product. In fact, it's so great that users keep using it. And it's easy to see why. You know, back in the day, collaboration meant a call to the help desk to set up network shares and permissions so that other folks could see our stuff. And despite all that, there was no version control. You know, there was no way of knowing which version of a document was definitive. And there were a million copies of everything lying around all over the place. It was really impossible to keep track of stuff. And then along came SharePoint, and that made collaboration possible. Because SharePoint gives us easy enterprise content management. But here's the problem. SharePoint makes it so easy for us to create stuff that the volume of stuff that we're managing has exploded. And I've seen a lot of cases where folks have deployed MOS without really giving much thought to the implications. And before they knew what was going on, they had a mountain of content so huge that it was impossible to find anything. And then, when SharePoint 2010 came along, these same folks, having learned from the mistakes, put a lot of thought into how their SharePoint content should be structured. They had information architects who designed clever classification systems, and SharePoint architects who did a grand job in implementing them. But did that fix the problem? Well, like everything in the SharePoint world, it depends on who you speak to. One of the big features of any information architecture is metadata, and unfortunately users aren't big fans. You know the story, Bob's been working on a document all afternoon, he's getting another meeting in 2 minutes, he uploads his document to SharePoint and bam, he's hit with a page of metadata that would show for a horse. Now, of course, it goes without saying that we'd all take the time to select the proper values for each and every field, but poor Bob's in a real hurry. You know, he fills in as little as possible to get this thing saved. He'll come back and fill it in when he's got time. Of course, I think we know that's never going to happen. And the result's inconsistent metadata. And you can imagine how happy Bob is when he still can't find his document, despite all of this newfangled information architecture. So we've seen that SharePoint gives us easy enterprise content management, and that it can be a victim of its own success, giving us a few problems. What can we do to fix these problems? Well, the first thing we can do is apply an information architecture. It's easier to find stuff if you've got some idea of where it should be. You know, it's much easier to find a specification for a product if you know there's a specifications library in the product engineering site. The next thing we can do is apply consistent metadata. A lot of the time where something should be is determined by what it is. So for example, if it's a proposal, it should be in the client proposals folder. Reduce user burden. Now it's essential to have an information architecture, but it's always going to be a balancing act between a perfect architecture and something that users will actually use. You know, it's all fine and well having an architecture that requires contracts to be placed in the legal documents library under the appropriate business unit and tagged with details of the customer and any associated products and the geographical region and maybe the start and end date of the agreement. But how well is that going to sit with users? And will they select all of these associated products, or even any of them? And what if the customer details aren't on the system? Will they jump through these hoops day in and day out? And if they don't, what are the implications for our information architecture? We need to make it as easy as possible, or these folks simply won't use it. The last point I've got here is context-sensitive search. Now, how many times have you read in a list of user requirements, Google-like search experience? Has anybody ever seen that done in a business context? Personally, I haven't. I mean, I've seen attempts at it, but none that actually allow people to find stuff. So why not? Why doesn't it work? Well, in my opinion, precision. If you go to Google or Bing and you start typing some keywords, you're probably looking for general information on a topic. So for example, if I search for Victorian architecture, I'm happy with 24 million results, where the first few provide some general information. But let's say I want to find a very specific piece of information, say the price to replace the starter mechanism on the chainsaw. This time 3 million results aren't quite so useful, and I'll spend a bit of time bouncing around trying to get exactly what I want. Now, user search in SharePoint tend to have a very precise focus. They're usually not looking for general information on a topic. They want specific information in a specific format so that they can use it for a specific purpose. They know the information's in there, they just don't know how to get it back out again. And bouncing around for a while drives these guys nuts. Now, one of the reasons users can't find what they need in SharePoint is that a lot of their queries are unspoken. So for example, if Alice works in the legal department and does a search for a particular product, she's probably looking for contracts and other similar documents related to that product. Whereas if Bob, who works in the sales department, does the same search, he's interested in price lists and product specifications. The difference between Alice and Bob is context, and there's just no way to allow for context in a Google-like search experience. Google, Bing, etc. are all one size fits all, and that just can't work in the enterprise environment. We need to build context-sensitive search experiences to help our users get to the stuff that they need quickly. So we've seen the problems, and we've touched on some of the solutions. Where does Semaphore come in? Well, firstly, let me explain what Semaphore is. Semaphore is a content intelligence platform. So what does that mean? Well, here's how it works. You tell Semaphore what's important to your organization. Your products, your market segments, your organizational structure, pretty much anything. Now, there's nothing new here. A lot of this stuff you already know because your information architects used it to devise the architecture for your SharePoint deployment. Once Semaphore knows what's important, it examines your content and tells you how your content relates to those concepts. So for example, if you give Semaphore a PDF copy of a contract, it will come back and tell you that it's a contract. It will also tell you which customer it's with, when it starts, when it ends, and which products it refers to. And here's the clever part. Once you know these things, you can act on them. You can store the item in the correct place, you can apply the correct metadata, make sure the permissions are set correctly, and even kick off an automated business process. And you can do all this stuff consistently. Better still, you can do it all without hassling your users. And as we've said, that's a key point in making an information architecture that actually works in practice. So enough with the talk. Let me demonstrate some of this stuff actually working for you. Okay, so we'll start by taking a look at a simple example of classification. Now in SharePoint 2010 and in SharePoint 2013, Microsoft gave us the term store on the enterprise keywords column. And these two things made it possible for users to tag documents. So let's take a look at how Semaphore can automatically populate this column. So we'll just drag in a document and it will get classified. Now, by the way, these demos use document libraries for simplicity. Semaphore can be used for any type of content, documents, lists, wikis, and publishing pages, whatever you need to do. Okay, so that's done, and we can see our enterprise keywords columns being pre-populated with composters and composting. And these are terms from our model, and Semaphore has determined that this document is about these two concepts. So that's a simple example. Now in the real world, Our information architecture is probably more complicated than adding an enterprise keywords column everywhere. Let's take a look at how we can do the same thing with multiple columns of different types. Now this time, just for variety, let's use the upload document button. And we'll upload this document. The Semaphore processes content no matter how it's added or updated in SharePoint. You can drag and drop as we saw. You can use the upload document button, Windows Explorer, or even SkyDrive or OneDrive as it's now known. The metadata is still going to be applied automatically on add and again on update. So there we go. This document library has 3 columns, and as you can see they've been populated automatically. Now if we wanted to modify this, let's say the user determines that this term isn't appropriate, we can simply go in here and delete it and save the changes. And what will happen is the next time the document's edited or it's reclassified, the fact that we manually edited those classifications is recorded and they won't be overwritten by automatic classifications again. So we've seen there how classification works by using your model to determine what metadata is appropriate. But what if we want to add metadata that isn't in the model? You know, stuff that changes things like places, dates, organizations, people. Let's take a look at how Semaphore can help with that. Now here we've got a document library set up with 3 managed metadata columns, and these columns are set up to allow user-defined terms. So what we're going to do this time is just manually handcraft a document. We'll use Windows Explorer View. We'll just create a new text document. Let's just put some content in there. What I'll do is I'll just grab some content from the BBC News website. We'll just use that for simplicity. And we'll save that back to SharePoint. Okay, that looks like it's done. Let's go in here and refresh the page. And there we go, this is a new document and we see locations, organizations and people have been automatically populated based on the contents of a document. Now let's say we wanted to change that document. Maybe to add the breaking news that Albert Einstein paid a surprise visit. So we can just go in here. And we can save these changes back to SharePoint. If we go back in here and refresh the page, we can see that Albert Einstein's made it into a list of people who says that time travel is impossible. So that's how Semaphore works with out-of-the-box SharePoint columns. Now as well as that, we've also added a new column type that's based on the MMS column, but it's got a much richer user interface. And let me show you some of the differences. Classification in this column works in the same way as before. You can add and update content and the classifications are automatically stored in the column. Let's take a look at the properties for this document. The first thing you'll notice is that the classifications are in blue boxes, and the shading of these block boxes gives us a visual indicator of how relevant a term is to the document. So for example, in this case, changing school is more relevant than children's centres. Now if we click on one of these blue boxes, we see a callout that gives us more information on the term. When using a standard managed metadata column, the most you can get is the term description. And since Semaphore allows us to create ontologies with metadata attached to each term, we can make use of that here to give our users more information about a term. Now this stuff's all templated, so you can put pretty much anything in here, you know, text, images, hyperlinks. You can even extend this menu on a term-by-term basis if you need to do that. Now let's look at the term picker interface, and again we've added a few useful bits in here. The first thing you'll see is there are tabs along the top. The first tab here, Browse, is pretty much the same as you're going to get with the standard MMS column. The only difference is that a standard MMS column can only be bound to a single term set, whereas a Semaphore column can be bound to multiple term sets. So what you're actually seeing here is 4 separate term sets. The next tab, Visualize, is where you can really see the difference between the simple models that are supported by SharePoint and the richer models that are possible with Semaphore. Now, since models can have multiple relationship types, a hierarchy isn't always the best way to browse, since it can only show one parent-child relationship. With our Visualizer, we can see multiple relationships at the same time, and we can follow these around as much as we like, navigating pretty much any relationship type. So you see I've got a determines a service relationship here. I can follow that. And as well as that, you can see we've got additional term information in the panel on the right-hand side here. Now the third tab here is Classify, and this uses classification to suggest terms for a document. Now here we've got a list of terms and their relevance. Our users can then pick whatever they need, and you'd normally use this in a situation where you wanted explicit user feedback rather than automatic classification. The final tab here is Search. Now this isn't your standard search function. As well as matching term names, it will also match synonyms. So for example, if I type dumped cars, it's going to bring back abandoned vehicles as well as a whole load of other stuff about cars. And the reason for that is that dumped cars is a synonym for abandoned vehicles. And this means that users don't need to know the exact name of the term. They can enter related concepts and still get to the right place. As well as these changes in the user interface, the Semaphore column also allows greater configuration flexibility. With a standard managed metadata column, you're bound to a single term set, as I said, whereas with a Semaphore column, you can use multiple term sets. Not only that, but you can apply filters to restrict what can be selected and what the user can see using any of the metadata that you've added to your model. So hopefully you can see that by combining these techniques, we can really make our information architecture work for us. And better still, we can do it without irritating our users, you know, Alice and Bob. So that's it for classification. Let's take a look at what Semaphore adds to search in SharePoint. The first thing to mention is that Semaphore isn't limited to SharePoint content. In fact, in SharePoint 2013 and fast for SharePoint 2010, we can apply metadata to anything that can be crawled. So for example, these are some search results from the BBC News site that have been automatically tagged, and we can see some of the tags in the refiner on the left here. Now, as organisations make the jump from SharePoint 2010 to SharePoint 2013, backwards compatibility is important. And we can see here that SharePoint 2010 content can be crawled from SharePoint 2013. But what might not be so obvious is that classifications work across both systems. So for example, if I search for care, I'm going to get back results from SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint 2010. But more than that, my refinement panel works across both systems. So if I click on, let's see, childcare and preschool learning, you see I've got a result from SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013. Now, out of the box SharePoint, that just doesn't work because there are two different term stores. With Semaphore, it's portable because Semaphore becomes the master for the term store, and it pushes identical copies down to as many SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013 farms as you need. In fact, we can use this data for much more than just SharePoint, but of course that's a story for another day. As well as being able to classify crawl content, Semaphore also provides some web parts that let you make better use of your model to drive search. And in this page we can see a few of them. At the top here we've got the Semaphore search box, and as we type stuff, we get suggestions. And these are terms from our model, and you see we've got result counts. Gives our users some idea how many results they're going to expect if they search for that term. The other thing we have is term information callout. So if you stick your mouse over one of these results, you're going to see a list of the tags for that document, and we can click in these tags to execute other searches. Another web part we have is concept mapping. So here if we search for business, we're going to get some suggested terms, each with a result count. And if we mouse over one of these terms, we get the same customizable term information that we saw earlier with the Semaphore column. And again, we can click on these to execute further searches. What you're seeing here is the related terms web part. Now, we've searched for content tagged with business development. From our model, we know that the terms economic development and regeneration are related. And if we want to, we can click on these to do another search. Also at the top here, we've got the breadcrumb. Because we're searching for a term in our model, we have a breadcrumb that shows us exactly where we are in the main hierarchy. And we can click on these to widen the search. So let's say we want to expand the search, we can click up to business practice and regulation. And again, we've got the related terms web part populated with other suggestions. So these are just a few of the web parts that we have available, and we're using the standard SharePoint Search Center template here. We spoke about context-sensitive search earlier, where search experiences are tailored to suit particular audiences. So let's look at how we can use a few more of these Semaphore web parts to build these kind of interfaces. So the first example I have here is using our taxonomy browser web part to browse through content. We've got a model here on the left, and as we look through this, we can see search results automatically being populated here on the right hand side. And we see as we navigate through this, the search results automatically change, as does the breadcrumb at the top. And we can bounce around our model like that. So this provides an alternative way for users to browse all the content in the system. Now the next example I have here is a glossary. Here we've got an A to Z index of terms in our model, and again users can browse through to find the topic that they're interested in. You can see the whole thing's pretty dynamic. Now the last example I have here uses our visualization web part. Here we can hop around our model following any relationship type we like. And as we click in terms, we're seeing term information here on the right hand side, as well as search results at the bottom. And when we click in terms here on the right hand side, you see the visualization controls automatically updated. So you see we can easily tie all of these web parts together to provide a dynamic user experience. So we've seen a few of the web parts that we can provide as part of Semaphore for SharePoint, and hopefully I've shown you how easy it is to build the kind of rich interactive user experiences that will make it easier for Alice and Bob to find what they're looking for. That's it from our demo. Let me jump back to the slides and we'll sum up. Okay, so we've talked the talk and we've walked the walk. Let me summarize the points I wanted to make in this presentation. Buying into SharePoint is a no-brainer for most organizations. We don't want to go back to the days of 1 million copies of every document and a call to the help desk every time we want to share something. But SharePoint comes with a price tag. Content is much easier to manage, but throwing absolutely everything into a giant filing cabinet means we need sophisticated file systems if we're ever to find anything. Now, coming up with these systems is the job of information architects, and implementing them is the job of SharePoint architects, but actually making use of these things on a day-to-day basis falls to our poor users, Alice and Bob. When every upload means completing a page of metadata that would have an ambidextrous octopus complaining of RSI, these guys are starting to wonder whether the bad old days were really so bad after all, especially when they still can't find stuff. Now we've seen in our demo today that Semaphore bends over backwards to remove the burden from the user. The information architect models what's important and trusts Semaphore to apply the metadata automatically. We've also seen that Semaphore provides a range of dynamic web parts that allow us to make good use of our information architect's hard work. So with all of this stuff handled, we can focus on adding value by creating useful, context-sensitive search experiences. Alice and Bob will be able to find the stuff quickly, the help desk can get back to playing our real tournament, and we can all live happily ever after. Thank you all for listening. I hope you found this presentation useful. I'm going to take a few questions now.
Charlie, thank you for that. I have to say I feel a little bad for Alice and Bob after listening to all of that. So we're going to go to questions. I'm also going to put up the slide with Charlie's contact information if I can get the slide to advance. I had that problem a little earlier so that you all can see. You can actually write down this. I'm still having that problem. I don't know what's going on. But I'll put it up in just a second. Charlie, I'm going to lob your first question to you. Someone has asked if the Semaphore taxonomy picker is exposed in a unique column type, or is it separate from a managed metadata column?
Sure, okay. The taxonomy picker is exposed a few different ways. It's exposed as a web part, and we saw that towards the end there in one of the demo search interfaces. It's also exposed as a custom control, so if you're doing custom development, you can add the picker into whatever you need to build. And again, it's exposed as a custom column. So at the beginning of the demo, we saw standard classification using standard MMS columns, and then we jumped over to the Semaphore column, and in there we saw taxonomy pickers. So that's just adding that custom control that we've got there.
Okay, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes before the top of the hour, so let's see if we can get a couple more questions in. Someone else says you showed entity extraction in the demo, and does that use the entity extraction stuff that's been added to SharePoint 2013?
Okay, that makes sense. So in 2013 they've added entity extraction, and this has come over from the FAST product. It was available in SharePoint 2010. The entity extraction that we're using is different. The stuff that's built into SharePoint and was built in FAST required us to upload a list of the entities we wanted to extract. So you would give it maybe a dictionary of company names or something like that, and it would effectively look for those in the content. The entity extraction we're using here uses the linguistic processing capabilities of the Semaphore platform. So it's going to extract entities without that pre-populated list.
Yeah, so just a question I'd like to clarify. You can do this on a per document basis, obviously, which is what you just demoed, but you can also do it for batches of content, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can classify, let's say, an entire document library. We've added stuff to the user interface to make that simple. And using PowerShell, you can classify pretty much anything. You know, you could classify an entire SharePoint farm, for example.
Okay. Someone says looks like you're using SharePoint 2013, and do you have a product for 2010, and how does that compare to the 2013?
Well spotted, we were indeed using SharePoint 2013. We do have a product for SharePoint 2010, and we also have a product for MOS if you're still using that. The classification aspects between 2010 and 2013 are pretty much identical. But there are some differences in the web parts. In SharePoint 2013, we've tried to make use of the new display template stuff that Microsoft's added in there. And because of that, that's allowed a lot more flexibility. In 2010, we didn't have that flexibility, so we've added a few more web parts to kind of work around that. The pipeline classification stuff that I showed you, where we saw the BBC content tag, that obviously doesn't work in native SharePoint 2010. It would need FAST for SharePoint 2010.
Okay. And how do users create the model that you've mentioned?
That's a good question. Semaphore's been designed as an enterprise content intelligence platform. So as well as SharePoint, we integrate with other systems like Documentum, OpenText, and Google Search Appliance. And users are going to create and manage their models using our Ontology Manager product, which is a rich client application. The Semaphore platform then pushes the model down to wherever it's needed, so it's going to push it to SharePoint, it's going to push it to OpenText, you know, pretty much whatever we need to do with the thing.
Okay, I think we can do one more question. Let's see. Do you have any solution for tooltip functionality which scans content in underlined terms in the ontology and shows definition on a hover click?
Sure. So if you're using the Semaphore column, we've basically extended the tooltip. A standard MMS column, all you get is the term description, which is pretty useless. If you use the Semaphore column, when you click on the term, you've got this call-out panel, and everything in there is flexible. The whole thing's templated using the new display template stuff in 2013. So you can display any content from your model. You can display, you know, images, hyperlinks, whatever you need to show.
Okay, and I'm going to do one more question and then let everyone get back to their lunch. So it may have been addressed, but can a user add their own taxonomy for a very specific material?
Yeah, so using the Ontology Manager tool, you can import whatever you've got, whether it's ZTHs or SCORs, and that can act as the basis for your model.
Great. Well, Charlie, thanks. Everyone, if you have questions for Charlie about the webinar, please feel free to get in contact with him. Let us know if you would like to have a one-on-one presentation. We're happy to walk you through that particularly. We will send out a copy of the webinar for you to watch again if you'd like, and we might be able to talk Charlie into giving you some slides as well, although most of that was a live demo, so I'm not sure how much that might help you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you in the